Saudi Arabia's ambitious economic plans. The kingdom has announced several multi-billion-dollar projects to diversify its economy away from oil. But can it afford these large projects, and how likely are they to become a reality? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. Saudi Arabia has embarked on an extensive economic and social transformation. Crown Prince Mohammed Bin Salman has made it his mission to make the country less dependent on oil and diversify its economy. But that's proving challenging because of several factors, including the war in neighbouring Yemen. Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners have been fighting Houthi rebels there for nearly 3 years now. And as the Saudi government announces more mega projects as part of its so-called Vision 2030 strategy, there are concerns it might be overextending its economy. We'll get to our guests shortly, but first, Laura Burden-Manley looks at what's in the pipeline.
Saudi officials have made it clear the country is entering into a post-oil era. Now, this future vision involves the building of megacities to promote what's being dubbed a knowledge economy. So let's take a look at some of these new projects. The first planned megacity is called NEOM. It's supported by Japanese giant SoftBank, and it aims to be the largest city in the world to run on 100% renewable energy. It's intended to be about 33 times the size of New York, costing around $500 billion. And there's a solar power plan worth $200 billion, touted as the world's largest such project. Now, Saudi Arabia also has plans with Egypt to build a large city on the Sinai Peninsula, and that's costing about $10 billion. And a $44 billion refinery deal with 3 Indian companies. Now, Saudi Arabia won't fund these projects alone, but the estimated costs will be more than $760 billion. Now, the numbers indicate the kingdom could struggle to pay for them.
Well, let's now take a look at Saudi Arabia's financial resources. The kingdom has around $480 billion in cash reserves. It had far more in 2014 when it started burning through the pile. That's because oil prices began falling sharply after a peak of $115 a barrel that summer. And it's only this year that it came back to the $70 mark. That's led to Saudi Arabia spending more than it earns the past few years. It's estimating a budget deficit of just over $50 billion this year. The Saudis are hoping to raise at least $100 billion by selling a 5% stake in the oil giant Aramco. But that's assuming the company is worth $2 trillion, as officials assert. Some of this money, though, has to be spent on weapons. At $56 billion, the biggest item on the annual budget is defense, especially with the war in Yemen showing no signs of ending. So, is Saudi Arabia spreading itself thin? Let's bring in our panel. From Virginia, joining us on Skype is Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist, columnist and author. In London, Anastasia Nesvetailova, director of the City Political Economy Research Centre at City University of London. And in Washington, D.C., Robert Mogilnicki, senior analyst at the D.C.-based consultancy Siwa Group, where he specializes in the political economy of the GCC. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Jamal Khashoggi, if I can start with you, does Saudi Arabia have the political power and economic resources to pull this off?
I don't know. It is very challenging. As a Saudi Arabian, I wish those mega projects would succeed, but I would rather to see the country and the leadership looking more into turning the Saudi society into a productive society by providing jobs. I mean, we need to do more of economy 101 that start from inner cities in Jeddah, in Riyadh, downtowns, look at the poverty rate there, look at the unemployment rate there, and fix them. Infrastructure, and fix the infrastructure there. If we secure the present, if we secure this pace, then we can move on to the future. I would like to see the Crown Prince looking more and more into the inner city, into the current situation, the poverty situation, rather than looking at the future.
When you talk about moving on to the future, Would you say that Saudis today are convinced that change is inevitable?
Change is happening, but the top-down approach could be risky. I think the leadership in Saudi Arabia is very much influenced by the success or the model of Dubai. It is a success there in Dubai, but it cannot be duplicated. Saudi Arabia is not a city-state. It is a country. The Crown Prince has under his hand millions of youth who are looking for jobs. He provided for them entertainment and fun and cinemas, but they need money to enjoy life. So they need jobs. The jobless in Saudi Arabia number are about 20% of the population. Then we are talking about something like 2 million people who need jobs desperately. He needs to spend more time there because those are the people who could get angry one day if they don't have the jobs.
Let's get Anastasia's view in London. Anastasia, as Jamal mentioned there, a number of countries have tried to build their own Silicon Valleys, to have their own mega projects. Some have succeeded, others have failed. Do you think Saudi Arabia is going to be able to succeed? Are they going to be able to afford this grand vision for the economy?
Interestingly, I think the question is more political than it is financial. It could be that the financial resources are there, at least for the short term. But in terms of political vision, commitment, and actually having a strategy, it could be that the vision is not quite formulated. And it can be exposed to a variety of unexpected shocks from inside, from outside, something that economists would call exogenous. So to an extent, it's a complex dilemma about the solidity of the vision for a new developmental program, the content of that program. And I would agree with your previous contributor that it's not quite clear what that particular model is in the current reform in the country. And the broad geopolitical climate, which is very challenging.
Okay, Robert, do you agree with that? Are the financial resources there, in your opinion? How likely are these mega projects to become reality, bearing in mind that they are by no means the only things that Saudi Arabia will be spending money on in the coming years?
Well, absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember that these new projects that we've started to hear about in later in 2017 and over the past few months, they follow a longer history of mega projects within Saudi Arabia. So back in 2015, it's important to note that there were a whole range of economic cities that were launched as part of SAGIA's, the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority, which initially planned to launch 6 economic cities. They scaled that back to 4. When the global financial crisis of 2008 came, many of those projects were put on hold. So in order to get a firm understanding of the context of these mega projects in Saudi Arabia, it's really important to understand that there's a much longer history that goes beyond 2017.
Right.
In terms of the finances, yeah, that's a really important element. Traditionally, the state has put forth funding. So in terms of economic cities, the state put forth about $70 billion, and then they expected private sector contributions, both from local actors and global firms, to make up the difference. I think that if we look at the current economic environment in Saudi Arabia, it's going to be very difficult for the state to put forth that same commitment in terms of funding, especially with the price of oil dropping.
Right. But they're hoping, as you know, to raise at least $100 billion by selling a 5% stake in the oil company Aramco. Do you think investors' appetite for the Aramco IPO is a certain thing? Are they thrilled with the prospect of acquiring Aramco stock?
Well, I think there certainly is interest on a global scale. The question really is, when will this happen? We had an initial date for the IPO that was delayed. And exactly what will be the details? The devil is always in the details. So I think we're still at this point where we're waiting to see what will happen in terms of that IPO. where what type of details will come out of it, and really where will the value be. And I think once a lot of those pieces become a bit clearer, then we'll start to see more firm interest from local investors as well as international investors.
Jamal Khashoggi, as we've heard there from both Anastasia and Robert, there are very few details as to where the money is going to be coming from. Military expenditure in Saudi Arabia is extremely high right now. They're spending a lot of money in the war in Yemen, and there's even been talk this week of possibly sending Saudi troops to be part of a so-called coalition, US-led coalition in Syria. Do you think they will need to cut back on some of this military spending? Will they have to make a choice at one point between addressing the domestic issues at home and, their foreign policy?
The mood now in Saudi Arabia, it is Saudi Arabia first. You can check this hashtag and you will see many Saudis are talking about that. That is the mood today in Saudi Arabia. I don't think the Syria adventures will take place. It's too early. It's a very preliminary idea, and I don't think I do not anticipate to see great numbers of Saudi troops in Syria. I don't think that will happen. But where there is a need to check on the budget. There's a need to spend wisely. Actually, Prince Mohammed Bin Salman came with this promise, and he introduced to Saudi Arabian people the term efficient spending, and that one of his aim to provide or to support the budget with efficient spending, and we need to do that. But efficient spending require a system of check and balance, transparency. We don't have that yet, but that's the promise we got: efficient spending, and we need to see that, especially if
that you talk about,
if we have
Jamal.
a huge budget to come.
This mood of Saudi Arabia first that you talk about, that you say is prevalent right now among Saudis, is that something that the Crown Prince and the leadership is hearing? And if they are hearing that message of Saudi Arabia first, will they act on it? Will they, for instance, pull out of Yemen and not get involved in Syria? Is the leadership hearing the people's message?
You see, Saudi Arabia feel under threat, and me as a citizen, I feel also under threat. I don't like to see the Iranians expanding around us, and I think that the responsibility of my government is to protect the future of my son and my grandsons from those Iranian domination in the region. I don't want the Iranians to change the history of the Middle East and expand into Syria, because Syria is part of my region, my world, my history. Same in Yemen. So I do support my government in its in confronting the Iranians. I just hope they will do it right. We need to do it right, and we need to confront the Iranians. But on the same time, we need to be balanced about the spending. Maybe by doing it right, maybe we can do it with less money by supporting Arab Spring aspiration and the aspiration of democracy in Yemen and Syria. That will drive the Iranians out much faster and less costly than continue with the war efforts.
Anastasia, coming back to the finances, there have been reports that Saudi Arabia, in order to raise money, is targeting higher oil prices in order to balance its budget. They reportedly want a price target of $100 a barrel for oil, enabled to keep up with these domestic projects. How realistic is that? How much influence do they have in bringing up these oil prices?
Yeah, the $100 price seems to be magical, and not just for the Saudis. Russian officials sometimes discuss it as a potential target. However, I don't think it's actually realistic in the short to medium term, and much less in the long term. And it's not necessarily about the power of these states individually or even together, although the partnership between Saudi Arabia and Russia, for example, has been more successful than previously anticipated. The problem is more structural. It's about how these countries can adapt to the rapidly changing energy geofield where renewables and alternative sources of energy are becoming predominant. And those developments are really not predicting any hike in oil prices anytime soon.
So if you talk about economic models where certain countries spread themselves thin, Saudi Arabia is not an exception in it, is it? You mentioned Russia, for instance. They're also spreading themselves thin when it comes to their economy, their involvement in Syria, and so on. How does Saudi Arabia's economic woes affect the rest of OPEC countries and its regional partners?
Another fascinating question. I think it adds, it creates lots of questions where people don't necessarily have answers to, and that can create certain political, I'm not saying risks, but the unknowns. It might have an effect on the markets, on stock prices, on, as you mentioned before, IPOs, or a variety of projects that need to be valued in the future. But in some way, it's too early to say. This new reform in the country has been a relatively recent development, and we simply don't know enough. There isn't kind of a very thick database of big changes in the country that we can draw upon.
Robert Mogul, Nikki, your thoughts on this. If Saudi Arabia is struggling economically, how does it affect the rest of this region and also OPEC producing countries, oil-producing countries?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. We can look at it in a number of different ways. First and foremost, Saudi Arabia is now targeting Kuwait. Saudi Arabia is now looking into Iraq and its reconstruction efforts. And that has a real potential to conflict with Kuwaiti development aims. And Kuwait recently launched an integrated economic zone in the 5 uninhabited islands in the northeastern part of the country. It also has a major project named Silk City. Mm-hmm. These two projects are planning to target the Iraqi and also the Iranian markets. So we see in this move towards the Iraqi market, we see a potential for conflict with Kuwait. At the same time, we also had news coming out of in the last couple of days about Saudi's intentions to create a channel along its border with neighboring Qatar. Right. Obviously, there's been a tense relationship there, but looking ahead, I agree with Anastasia. We have to see what happens. There are plans to put a free trade zone, a tourist hub, and also potentially a nuclear waste site on that border. So clearly, moving ahead with those plans, specifically the latter ones involving a nuclear waste plant, would certainly raise tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and potentially make engagement in the future more difficult.
Jamal Khashoggi, your thoughts, looking ahead, not just regionally, but first domestically, if you could tell us, how do you see these various plans, these mega projects, addressing and affecting the fundamental challenges, the fundamental issues that Saudi Arabia faces today, and that is high youth unemployment, weak education and health systems? Is it going to address these issues?
This is the premise, but those are all high-tech jobs providing projects. I would much rather, as I said earlier, to go to basic economy, to change the Saudi society into a productive society, free the Saudi labor market from over-dependency on foreign labor. Foreign labor still constitutes 60% of the labor force in Saudi Arabia. This is very much wrong. This is very much unnatural for an economy, and it had to be fixed. Of course, if those mega projects succeeded and provided an extra income, a bilateral income to the Saudi budget next to the oil, it will be great news. But if they fail, God forbid.
Yeah. What would be the political implications, Jamal, of failure if these projects fail? I mean, they are the idea of the Crown Prince, the new Crown Prince. This is his plan, his baby. What would be the political implications if this was to fail?
Huge, because we are talking about what is budgeted for those projects is something like about $700 billion, more than $500 billion. And all what we have right now in our assets in foreign currency, something like 400 billions. Add the Aramco 100 billion, that is 500 billions. What if that money goes to waste? What if those projects turn into a white elephants? This is scary. It's a scary scenario. That's why I would like to see more check and balance in Saudi Arabia, so such adventures will not go unchecked. Those ideas need to be checked by the Saudi society because it is our future altogether.
Anastasia, your thoughts about the consequences, both economic and political, perhaps, if you can touch on them, of any failure?
I agree. The consequences could be very huge regionally and perhaps globally. Financially, interestingly, it would just be a waste of money, because the content of a long-term strategic redevelopment of the economy is not yet quite clear. The megacity project is there. Some sort of service-based offshore society or offshore hub for the service economy and high-tech is there, but Saudi Arabia would be joining others who already are there and very present in this particular market. So it's challenging, but in some way a bit more predictable. Politically, it can generate a lot of, a failure can generate a lot of resistance and possibly reaction towards the new regime, and then potentially there will be major consequences for the oil price and regional security.
Robert Mogul-Nikki, your thoughts? Surely there's no turning back from this momentous reform project for the new leadership in Saudi Arabia. How do they go about addressing the various challenges, mainly the economic challenges? Where do they get the money from to go through with these plans?
Well, I think you're right, and it's important to remember that the new regime, and specifically Mohammed bin Salman, actually specifically mentioned these mega projects in Saudi Vision 2030. He mentioned that former economic cities need rehabilitation. He specifically mentioned that he would like to revamp the King Abdullah Financial District. So we're already seeing a substantial amount of political and economic capital really being wagered on the successful completion of these projects. Again, new projects like NEOM, these are also tied directly to the Crown Prince's Saudi Vision 2030. So on the one hand, there certainly is a high bar to meet. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that we're looking at Saudi Vision 2030. This is not something that we can evaluate the success or failure of today. This is a long-term plan. And also these mega projects, many of them have long-term timelines. So we can start talking about them now, make sure that appropriate frameworks are in place, look at how money is being spent, look at processes, and make sure that they're done in transparent ways. But ultimately, this is something that we're going to have to assess over a long-term time frame.
All right. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. Jamal Khashoggi, Anastasia Nesvetailova, and Robert Mogul-Nikki. Thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.